Our next speaker, I think, is going to be exactly the kind of speaker where everyone keeps asking for, like, who is putting away the bad guys? Val Richey is putting away the bad guys. He's the King County Senior Deputy Prosecuting Attorney at the Special Assault Unit. He's been working on cases of sexual exploitation for the past 7 years. And focused on a lot of child cases in particular. So Val, without further ado, we're very happy to have you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I went to BU 20 years ago. Woo! And as a BU alumni, I'm well aware that I'm standing between all of you and wine. So I will move quickly. So if you look at your agenda for today and tomorrow, I think what you're going to see is a wide array of sectors that this conference is touching on: technology, public opinion and the media, health, labor, law, government policy, and so forth. And what makes my heart sing is when we can integrate all of those things, all of the wonderful work being done in each of those sectors into one cohesive model. And so what I'm going to talk a little bit about this evening is an example of how we've tried to do that in Seattle. This is a quote from a survivor named Rachel Moran, and she says, "How do you expect to uproot a tree when all you're doing is ripping at the leaves?" And she's sort of saying the same thing, which is, how do you expect to solve the problem of commercial sexual exploitation if all you're doing is helping victims? And what she was talking there was to the anti-trafficking community about holding people accountable, including both traffickers and buyers accountable for their work, because if we don't do that, we're going to just be doing it for all time. We're going to be providing services. And so that's why I call this Timber, uprooting the commercial sexual exploitation industry through a multi-sector approach. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our approach. But before you can talk about the what and the how, I think you need to talk about the why and what the landscape looks like. I think Wesley and Hannah and some others talked earlier about really needing to understand the area that you're trying to address. So in our world, in Seattle, we see the commercial sexual ecosystem sort of as involving three players, at least three. There's others like the bystanders, and it may not always involve a trafficker, but it at least involves somebody in prostitution who represents the supply and somebody who's buying who represents the demand. And what we try to do is kind of understand those things as a symbiotic relationship between those different players and how we need to impact the whole system. In our data, and this may not be true for everybody, but in our data, this is what we find. I can't go through all the data points with you, but I can tell you these are the conclusions. That a majority of people in prostitution that we see were child sex abuse victims. That they are homeless or unstably housed, either now or at some point earlier before prostitution. That they are victims of tremendous violence in prostitution, and that therefore, because of all the trauma they experience, they often meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. They are often female, but not exclusively. As we just heard from some folks, it's a mistake to think they're only female, but a majority of the ones that we interact with are female. They are often people of color. And they are, unfortunately, in our country, traditionally criminalized at a vastly disproportionate rate. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Meanwhile, sex buyers, in our experience, tend to be almost exclusively men, and I'm still waiting to meet a female sex buyer, but I can't say it's only. I just haven't, we haven't hung out yet. So above average education, middle upper class. So I think what you're starting to see here is a socioeconomic divide and an opportunity divide. Majority are married. I don't think that really matters at all, but everyone always asks me, so that's why it's in here. Majority white. It's at least consistent with the population, but there are some deviations that I'm going to talk about. And traditionally in our area, in our country, not held criminally accountable for what they have done, even though in every area except for the counties surrounding Las Vegas, both selling and buying are a crime. Traditionally, we've only prosecuted those who have been selling and hardly ever those who have been buying. So here's an example of the data that I'm talking about. In our area, minor victims of commercial sexual exploitation, 52% are African American. 7% of our population is African American. 52 to 7. Okay? That's not a little disproportionate. That's a lot disproportionate. Now, on the flip side of that, whoops, wrong way. 80% of buyers of minors are white men. Now, we live in a white area, but that is even disproportionately white in our area. So when you take all those factors, those criteria that I'm talking about, what you really start to see here is a system of power and privilege, a system that perpetuates racial, economic, and gender inequality. And it's not just a theory. It's supported time and time and time again in the data. And what noticeably, I haven't even mentioned the fact that there's a trafficker involved. Just looking at the difference in the data between buying and selling, I think what you see is gross inequality on a number of levels. And so what we did is started to kind of think about that, and I think this quote sums up a lot about what prostitution is really all about. This is a buyer that I'm actually currently prosecuting, and we found in one of his emails, he wrote this to some of his fellow buyers. War is great for the sex trade. And I took out the smiley face emoticon that he put after this, because for him it's excellent, right? And think about, just chew on this for just a second. What happens in war, right? People get moved, they get disadvantaged, they get turned out, their lives get turned over, they don't have opportunity, but get in a position of vulnerability and desperation, and then they are put in a position of, how do you make money? You make money through prostitution. Because men are in positions of power in those wars, right? And so we see that time and time again. The fact that a buyer is labeling what is happening is unbelievable to me. They know exactly what's going on and they don't care. It's an asset for them, right? So we are in the position of seeing this as the world, and what we have to do is design a response to it. So what we did is we built a collaborative of 5 organizations. 2 are prosecuting agencies, and one is a survivor service organization, one is a Seattle Against Slavery is an activist grassroots organization, and Businesses Ending Slavery and Trafficking is an entity, another NGO. What's unique about this is prosecutors and survivors collaborating. That's not common. I mean, it might be common on the academic world as we think about what would make sense, but in the practical world, it has not been common. And for a long time, the guy who I have worked with the most from the survivor organization kept saying in public meetings, I have to keep pinching myself because I'm sitting up here with a prosecutor. I'm like, come on, man. But that's the theory. That's what they're saying is like, we have had a tradition of being exploited by the criminal justice system, and now here we are collaborating. So what we did is we built this model. And this is the what, if you will, that we are trying to engage in. We talked about the why because we believe that there's a social injustice going on through commercial sexual exploitation. And the what is that we've built a model to try to respond to that. And on the left are the exploited persons. What we want to do is reduce their involvement in the system, offer them services, and establish alternatives. So Hannah mentioned before, if she's still here, Hannah mentioned that the situation of prices going down because somebody is desperate. The response to that cannot be the best we have to offer you is prostitution as a community. It cannot be that. It has to be, we have to establish alternatives. We have to establish services that allow you to then engage in an opportunity, an economic opportunity that doesn't involve risk of getting murdered. And so what we did is try to focus on getting folks out of the system, getting them stabilized. On the exploiter side, we want to prevent the exploitative behavior. We want to disrupt it. We want to intervene. We want to hold them accountable. And all that fits under an umbrella of cultural norms that really are supportive of equality on a number of levels rather than condoning inequality. So with that in mind, what we started with was trying to adjust our criminal justice system. So on the left in blue, you'll see that back in 2009, we prosecuted over 50 children for prostitution, right? Those were what I call the dark times. And I want to point out before I get stormed that I was not in this position at that time, okay? However, I was part of a system that needs to be held accountable for that kind of approach, right? So 50 victims, 50 prostituted children, 2 buyers. What did we think we were going to accomplish when we did that? Absolutely nothing. I mean, I don't know what philosophy was, but it was misguided for all the reasons that I talked about in the first 5 minutes here. But over time, what we did is systematically remove those children from the criminal justice system into a model that supports them with services and establishes alternatives through whatever counseling they need, whatever treatment they need, job opportunities, et cetera, education. And in 2013, we really aggressively started to go after men who are trying to buy sex from kids. And over the last 4 years, I've prosecuted about 200 of those guys trying to buy sex from children off the internet. So what I'm indicating to you is a fundamental shift in policy, which is what everybody in the country should be doing. And we're doing exactly the same thing on the adult side. In 2010 in our county, we had 450 prosecutions for prostitution. Last year, we had 37. Okay, so I want to get that down to 0, but we're pretty close. And that is not through law. That is through policy. That is our own policy that we have taken the initiative to establish. All right, everyone feels good, we can all go home, right? No, this is the problem. Is that what we found when we actually started doing what I think Wesley was talking about was understanding your landscape. Because you can develop good policies all you want, but if you don't understand the landscape, they're going to be stupid, misguided, and ineffective policies. So what we learned when we started looking at it is that the scope of the market was way bigger than we had any idea. We found over 100 websites where you could buy sex in Seattle alone, and one of those websites, Backpage, was averaging at its peak about 34,000 ads per month. I talked to you about arresting or prosecuting like 40, 50 guys a year. In 2014, Arizona State University did a study in our area. They concluded in one 24-hour period on one of those websites, there was nearly 7,000 men trying to buy sex. Not just looking, actively soliciting sex. So review boards are like Yelp for prostitution, and we had a review board in our area that was called, cleverly, the Review Board, and it had about 18,000 accounts. It's just a local board where people go on and share information about their prostitution buying. 18,000 accounts. And when we post a fake advertisement on Backpage and we get a response, like we posing as a young teenage girl online, it's not unusual to get 200 or 250 responses in the first 2 hours. You can imagine your inbox doing this, right? It would be traumatizing. The impact to us from looking at this data was a very strong gang rapey feel, right? There is an oppressive nature to this data that really undermines any feeling of comfort and consent and equality in these transactions. So you look at this, and this is where we came out on this. On the left side, we estimate through a number of different data points that there are about 3,500 people in prostitution in our area. On the right side, we estimate approximately, maybe conservatively, 20,000 buyers. It's probably more like 40 or 60,000. We can recover and rehabilitate and offer services all day long, every day on the left side. But if we don't do something about that right side, it's never going to stop. It will never stop. Nobody ever won this battle by simply providing services, nor did they ever win this battle by arresting people in prostitution. Nobody has ever succeeded through that policy. Here's the problem. Right now, at our best, when we're all in, we can arrest about 300 to 400 guys a year, which is that little red line. And this gets me to what I will now forever call Wesley's point, which is the following. What do we do about the rest? Because if we think that the criminal justice system is going to solve this problem, we're dead wrong. We cannot arrest our way out of this. And so that brings us to this very fundamental principle. Sex buying is an individual behavior problem, but it's also a social problem. So what we did in response to this conclusion is we created this, which does not have any of the labels. Does this happen to be like a 2007 version of Microsoft Windows? It's okay, because I remember the labels. So the red is criminal justice. The orange is government and social services. The yellow is technology. The green is education. The blue is employers, the darker blue is health, and the purple is public awareness. And the reason that's really important to think about those sectors is think how closely they mirror your agenda. I didn't tell them that. They just came up with it, and it happens to be precisely what we're focused on. And so I want to talk to you very quickly about a couple things that we're doing in a couple of these sectors. So I've already talked about red, criminal justice. Let's talk about orange, which is quite obviously government and social services. So in government and social services, I just want to give you an example of some policies that can start to change things here. So for example, if we want to change social norms, what we did is we crafted a proclamation for each of our city governments to adopt. And that proclamation identified commercial sexual exploitation as a problem and labeled demand as a root cause of that. It sounds so obvious and simple, but nobody had ever done that before. And what that does is it sets the tone for the community about where we feel that the culpability lies. If the police don't ever arrest a buyer, where do you think the culpability lies? With those 52 kids that we prosecuted for prostitution, right? So we have to change that dynamic by changing how we put forward the message to the community. Another example, the city of Seattle had a crime called patronizing a prostitute, which sounds approximately like going to 7-Eleven. But what they did is they changed it to sexual exploitation. Now, if you're standing in front of a jury, what's the difference in that label? Right? It's huge. It tells you a completely different story before you know any of the things that happen about where we think the problem lies. The other thing that we did in social services is developed an extensive buyer education program that's a 10-week program to work with buyers on their accountability. It's not a substitute for punishment. It's in addition to try to reduce their recidivism. Again, if we think sex buying is an individual behavior problem, we need some services that are going to try to prevent them from doing it in the future. Technology. So this is kind of how demand interacts with supply on the internet, through review boards, through search engines, and posting websites. Review boards I've already talked about, Yelp for prostitution. Search engines, Google, Bing, whatever. Posting websites, Backpage.com, where people in prostitution post ads. And this is one of the most efficient marketplaces in the world, is prostitution on the internet. And what we needed to do was put some friction in that. It couldn't be so easy. It can't be as easy as ordering pizza. So what we have to do is try to figure out a way to do that. And so we started looking at search engines. And one of the things that people use search engines for is to get to prostitution websites. They don't know what they're called, so they type in something that says like Escort Reviews Seattle, or I want an Asian escort tonight. I mean, this is real stuff that they put in. And, or young escorts, that's a big one. Teenage escorts, et cetera, et cetera. And what you get are 4 or 5 million results. Well, instead of this being a pipeline to an exploitation platform, what we wanted to do was put up a little stop sign along the way, just something to kind of rattle the guys who are using this. And so we came up with this idea here, which I'll read to you. It says, "Want to buy sex, cops are arresting buyers that if she's underage, you'll be a sex offender." And what that is what we call in Seattle a buzzkill, because you know, they're on there and they're trying to accomplish something that they think, you know, about buying sex, and this is going to be wonderful. And now we've just put an idea in their head about accountability and how that's going to feel. And I can't tell you that an ad like this is equivalent to an arrest, but what it is it's timed perfectly, because it's getting them at the moment when they're trying to interact with, trying to conduct that transaction. The other thing that's amazing about this is we got a little bit smarter as we went along, and we realized that we could time these ads to our arrests. So I talked before, that giant green bar with the little red part at the bottom, right? Such a tiny piece of that. But what matters is not how many arrests you do, but whether people think there's a credible risk of getting caught. And so what we started to do is we'd do a sting where we'd arrest 100 guys, and immediately after that, we'd put ads like this, like over 100 men arrested buying sex in Bellevue this month. Stop buying now before it's too late. And we would run those immediately after the arrests. And this ad, for example, we got really smart and we figured out how to target men on Facebook. And we ran this ad 108,000 times in the 2 weeks after that. We can arrest 200 or 400 guys a year. We ran this ad 108,000 times in 2 weeks to buyers or prospective buyers. The scaling that is possible through the intersection of technology and criminal justice is way beyond what we ever thought was possible. And what that allows us to do is to reach many more people in a very cheap and effective way. When they click on that ad, they're brought to a website that has information on penalties and so forth, but it also has this page that offers them services. And stunningly, of the website that we created, this is the #1 page visited. And it's because as we went along, again, a Wesley moment here, we started to learn that these guys were psychologically ambivalent about their activities. And many of them actually wanted to try to get help, which surprised everybody. Employers. So why employers? Well, buyers are employed by reputable organizations. And so we did some analysis of our cases and found that pretty much buyers come from every sector of our community. And the reason that matters is that employers are then an audience for us to talk to. And what we learned when we did those search ads, those ones where people were searching for sex and then they would get our ad, what we learned is the #1 time that they would click through on the ad, 2 p.m. They're at work trying to set up their date for after work. Now, who do you think does not like 2 p.m.? Businesses, right? Employers. They do not want their people at work searching for this instead of doing their work. It's just that simple. So what we then did is now we have the intersection of technology and criminal justice. Now we have the intersection of criminal justice, technology, employers, labor. And this is a way that we can then expand our reach to those guys as well. And what they can do is they can impact behavior. They have sexual harassment policies for anything that you do at work. Why do they not also incorporate into that policies that pertain to buying? Because looking at Backpage.com, it creates a hostile work environment for the people around them, just in the same way that looking at pornography does, or talking about jokes like that. It's exactly the same kind of conduct. So what we did is, through the Businesses Ending Slavery and Trafficking, we have an alliance of 36 partners that reaches over 200,000 employees. And it's engaging those businesses to try to start examining themselves and looking at policies that they can do to change their behavior. Health sector, and this is the last sector I'm going to talk about today, because this is one of the ones that's also on your agenda for the next couple days. So why engage the health sector? I already talked about sex buying being both an individual and really a social or public health problem. What do I mean by that? Well, when we talk to buyers, and we get a lot of evaluations of them, what we found is that 2/3 of buyers in a national survey reported that they wanted to stop. Anonymous survey, 2/3. If you have a practice that is that harmful to the people who are being bought, and 2/3 of the people doing it don't even want to be doing it, why are we allowing this to happen? Why do we not intervene? This is crazy. And so what we saw then is that sex buying, because they wanted to stop, what they were actually doing is buying as a symptom of all these other problems. Depression, anxiety, prior trauma, chemical dependency, et cetera, et cetera. So now we're talking about 15 to 20% of the adult male population engaged in harmful conduct that they don't want to be doing, that is a symptom of other problems, that is causing tremendous harm to the people who are being bought. That seems like an opportunity to engage folks through the health sector. And so what we wanted to do is engage the health sector on a different approach than has been done in the past. In the past, it's been done as a harm reduction. We need to make it as safe as possible for people in prostitution to do what they're doing. We took a slightly different approach, which is violence prevention. Harm reduction is a really good approach for short term. Safety planning, we call it. Here's how you can be safe until we can get you something else. But the long-term goal should be violence prevention, and the way you prevent violence is to stop the people from engaging in the conduct that actually constitutes the violence. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. There's some great training right now put out by the Department of Health and Human Services called the SOAR training. It's training healthcare providers to identify victims of sexual exploitation. I think one of the folks tomorrow is going to be talking about the HEAL project out of Harvard. Well, what we've been talking with HHS about and trying to get them to adjust is Why are we not also training them on identifying buyers? It's statistically much more likely that you're going to engage a buyer as a healthcare provider than a victim. And that's an opportunity to engage with somebody who clearly needs some intervention. And so let's talk to them about that. Sexual assault on campus. Let's talk to young men on college campuses, not just about not raping co-eds, but also about not purchasing sex. It's all part of the same continuum of conduct. So let's have a conversation about all of these things rather than just picking some of them. And at the time to talk about it is when you're already talking about some of these other topics. And then let's train these healthcare providers to make the right referrals. So without labels, this is our very a pretty pie. And what I hope you got from this was how we try to take all these different sectors, the sectors you're going to hear about this afternoon that you heard about and that you're going to hear about tomorrow, and really integrate them into a cohesive model that works together so that the sum of these parts becomes much greater than their individual impact. Thank you very much for having me. So I'm assuming that everybody wants to go drink wine, but maybe that's just me. If anybody has a question, I'm happy to answer it. Yes. Right behind you. Yes. Camera operator.
Hi. I was just listening to your talk, and since I'm also recording it, I wonder if you have any data, or have you ever tested or analyzed how it's working in other countries that actually have decided to legalize prostitution in terms of a way to control human trafficking, if that is actually effective or not, if this is something that is part of a discussion within the United States or not? So
there's quite a bit of disagreement about that topic, but our conclusion after having read many studies is that the countries that have tried legalization or decriminalization for both the sellers and the buyers have tended to see an increase in trafficking, including an increase in child prostitution and forced migration. Now, there's debate on that, so I'm happy to go talk about that some more. The countries that have tried decriminalization or legalization or something for just the selling side have tended to see a reduction in trafficking. That's the approach that we're taking. However, I will say that what we're trying to do through this multi-sector model is a little, in our view, a little more comprehensive than some of the other efforts at decriminalization. And so I think that if we recognize all of these opportunities and we really build a cohesive system, we believe that we can achieve success, which brings me to one point. We always get the question of, is it working? And here's what I'll tell you. The #1 search term that people use in Google and Bing to access prostitution in the United States is back page escort. Over the year that we ran these ads and started doing all of this work, that term in our area alone declined by 29%. It did not decline by 29% anywhere else in the country. And so what we saw, I cannot tell you which of these things did that, but I can say that there's some correlation there that's very promising. Other questions? Yes.
I have a data question.
Yeah.
In terms of Backpage. Oh, sure. Sorry. I had a more data-based question. In terms of the numbers on Backpage.com and other places where ads are placed, were you able to tell whether these ads were placed by individuals or individuals that place multiple ads that are associated with a larger sex trafficking ring?
So that's a really great question. What we can tell are unique phone numbers on Backpage, which is an indicator of individuals versus network, but certainly not dispositive. And what I mean by that is traffickers, particularly from Asia, will often buy blocks of phone numbers. Mm-hmm. And so it'll be like 5431, 5432, et cetera, through 1,000. So what we have been working with some partners on in a technology space is a development of a program that can look at ads on a huge scale and look for similarities in language structure, title, name, location, a bazillion factors, and do a mass sort of aggregation of that information and start to identify networks. And they just did a demo for us a few weeks ago, and I think it's really promising to start to identify networks. This is particularly true in the illicit massage parlor industry, where there are lots of networks, and we know this to be true.
Right.
Less networking in domestic minor sex trafficking, for example.
But you don't work with Backpage.com to trace it back to the IP address to see if it's coming from the same places?
So we do, well, first of all, I don't like to say ever that I work with Backpage. What we do is we compel Backpage through legal service to respond to our requests through a warrant.
Got it,
And
understood.
with the warrant, we get additional information. Now, you can get IP addresses, but the problem is it's very transitory, and the IPs are coming from all over because people, particularly in networks, the people who are selling are not the ones posting. It's other people who are centralized in different places. So it gets very, very complicated, which is why one of the things we can do is sort of look for metadata in pictures, look for similarities across. The problem is the human eye, that's very, very challenging. So this thing can do it on a massive level.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? Okay, well, I will be snacking out there. If you have questions, come and find me. I'm happy to answer them. Thank you all.